Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 22 of the Last Minute Wrestling Podcast. As always, I am your host from Italy, Frank Mandolini, and today's guest is one of my personal favorite YouTuber. I'm talking about David Lee, that you may know as Dave Knows Wrestling. Before we go to the interview with Dave, I must remind you that if you would like to get in touch, you can do it on Twitter at LMW Podcast, facebook.com/LMW Podcast, and if you want to support us with what we do here on LMW Studios, just go to ko-fi.com/LMW Podcast and buy us a coffee, or you can go to patreon.com/LMW Podcast and become a €5 Patreon backer or above. Now, let's move to the interview with David Lee from the YouTube channel Dave Knows Wrestling. Hi Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing? And thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, it's great to have you. Actually, I'm a huge fan of your show on YouTube, and this has been a dream to talk with you and to pick up your brain about what you do online with this wrestling thing.
Oh, thank you. That does mean a lot. It always does. It's very kind of you to say. So I'm honored to be on your show. So I like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Do you know if you have many followers from Italy? How the statistics are going? Do you know something?
No, I don't. But hey, if you have something that you need to tell me to enlighten me, I'm more than happy to learn.
Oh, well, I'm actually quite intrigued about Italian wrestlers. For example, I know that there were so many cool stories about Randy Savage's dad, that he was an Italian American, and he had.
Is it Angelo Poffo, great wrestler?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there are many names connected to Italy in the history of wrestling. Well, most famously Bruno Sammartino, of course.
Oh, cool.
And he was, I think, the last Italian to ever had a belt on WWE before nowadays we have Fabian Eichner as a part of the Imperium, and he is the NXT Tag Champ.
Yes. And I think one of the biggest keys that we've had with Bruno is that he, like a lot of people, younger people, don't realize how important he was to the foundation of WWF. And also, in terms of being an international superstar. Now, of course, the great Andre the Giant, big international superstar, but Bruno too. Bruno cross cultures. Bruno was known, around the world. He was a really big star, and so especially even before WWF in the NWA, which a lot of people also kind of forget about his time there when he was a young up and comer. But still, like Bruno has had a great legacy, and he was a major part of making the World Wrestling Federation actually a World Wrestling Federation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that part of his career is not covered enough, because myself, I really don't do much more about that than, for example, of course, his famous the longest WWF reign ever, and this kind of stuff. This is the most famous part of his career. But
Yes.
The beginnings that he had in the United States, that isn't covered oftenly, don't you think?
Right. Oh, no, I definitely agree, especially since I think there are some fascinating theories that go around there. Like my personal take on it, or, this is just what I believe.
Yeah.
But the way for these, if you're a wrestling historian, if you follow a lot of the history of wrestling, especially WWF, you know that the company started because Vince McMahon Sr. and Toots Mondt decided that they believed Buddy Rogers, a great wrestler, Nature Boy, the original Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, was supposed to be the champion. NWA had him as their world champion, but they decided to take the belt off of him because they were looking to go in a different direction. So what would become WWF, Capital Wrestling Corporation, split off and made Buddy Rogers their first champion. And wound up becoming the champion. However, he was only champion for a month. The first WWF, as it was known back then, world champion, only had the belt for a month. And he lost it to Bruno Sammartino. And as you pointed out, Bruno would have the belt for an astonishingly long amount of time. But the way I see it, the company kind of like with AEW now, the company did start on the principle about Buddy Rogers. They were looking for an established name in Buddy Rogers, but
Yeah.
kind of like with AEW and Chris Jericho getting that older established name. Unfortunately, Buddy Rogers' career wouldn't last too much longer after this. But really, the company was built around San Martino. So I looked at it like they really wanted Bruno to be the champ. They really wanted Bruno to be the guy, but they knew that they had to get more eyes on the product. They had to have a more recognized champ, and also that they felt that Buddy Rogers, unfortunately, wasn't given his justice. So yes, Buddy Rogers, of course, is the guy that they had, but I think Bruno was always meant to be the guy. Bruno was the first passing of the torch in WWF. Bruno was the first guy to be the face of the next generation. Bruno was the young up-and-comer. I know it's weird to think about Bruno being a young up, but that's exactly what it was. So, in my opinion, I think Bruno was always somebody that, including Buddy Rogers himself, had their eye on as being the future of the company.
Yeah, and it was like super young when he won the championship. I think it was like 26 or something. Correct me if
Yeah.
I'm wrong.
I think he was a little bit older than that, but it was pretty close, yeah, because The Rock was still the youngest champion when The Rock got it, and The Rock
Oh,
was
okay.
20. So, but they were close in age.
Okay, and as probably I learned through your videos, through your channel, that at the beginning the WWF really tried to push like Italians or with Pedro Morales, Hispanic people, because they wanted to. They had a greater appeal with the ethnic minorities in the United States, because at the time, like the newspapers, the more established newspaper, really snubbed wrestling, and the ethnic minorities that really didn't know how to read in English. They didn't have the chance to read all of these critics going towards those wrestlers, and that's why they put the belt on Bruno, for example, or later many other wrestlers that are coming from minorities. Is there any truth to what I just said, or
Oh,
I?
oh no, absolutely, absolutely. You're 100% right. Especially in New York City, because Capital Wrestling Corporation, or WWWF, and
Mhm.
what is now WWE, is a New York-based company. And despite their headquarters being in Connecticut now, they really tapped into the New York market because, as I was talking about earlier, the company that is now WWE started off technically as a territory within the NWA, and it was the New York territory when they broke off.
Yeah.
So they're still a very much New York-based product. And in that time period, especially, the Italian immigration community in New York City was huge. They're a essential backbone of New York City. There's no denying that. Anybody from I'm from New York myself, just so everyone knows. But the Italian American community is a major part of New York City. It always has been, always will
Yeah.
be, and there's no doubt about that. So here we have. It was also, but also, what I also think was important was that it gave a lot of Italian Americans a source of identity. And I think it's weird growing up in New York. Like, I don't know what it's, I don't know, if you're listening to this, I don't know if you have any experience around the world in America. And I understand Italian American cuisine is very different from Italian cuisine, not the same.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is very different.
But like in New York City or in the New York City area, if you go to a supermarket, you can find like, Italian or Italian American ingredients in pretty much like regular aisles. But then when you travel outside of New York City and you go to like the Midwest, it's like specialty ethnic cuisine, like it's not that common. Like you're like, what? Like, why do I have to go down to a special store just to find like Parmesan cheese or something? It's like, but that's what it's like in other parts of America. But in New York, it's just cheese. It's just, it's there. It's not a foreign product. It's part of the New York culture. But anyway, so my point of the matter is that's how big the Italian American community is. And even though they are not from Italy, let's also remember that big names like Hulk Hogan, Italian descent,
Mhm.
Terry Bollea, John
Yeah.
Cena, Italian descent. Like there's a lot, Macho Man Randy Savage, as you said. So like how many people in professional wrestling have an Italian background or Italian descent? So it's not it's not purely coincidence. There's something about the Italian American community that is not just a major backbone of New York City, but I would also say for professional wrestling too.
Yeah, exactly. And since you mentioned John Cena, do you know what the name Cena, which is not pronounced like that in Italian, do you know what that means?
No, but I am eager to learn right now.
Cena, which is pronounced Cena, imagine it like CHE, and Cena means dinner. So
Hmm,
he is literally John Dinner.
no kidding.
Yeah,
Nice.
exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the weirdest surname ever because personally I don't know anybody with that surname in Italy. It sounds like something that you may find in the southern part of Italy, to me, which is probably because there were so many migrants from that part of Italy to the United States. Of course, our most famous import probably
Mm.
was Al Capone, so,
Ah,
which which you may have heard of.
yeah, maybe. So it rings a bell.
Yeah, from like Sicily, this kind of part of Italy. But still,
I like that you said kind of part of Italy because that's what I hear very often. That Sicily's like kind of like Italy, but it's not 100%.
well, I'm going to reveal you and to all of our listeners a secret right now.
Uh,
Italy really doesn't exist. Trust me.
really?
It's yeah, it's
It's
a it's a weird country,
Yeah,
and
it's a relatively new nation, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken, right?
yeah, it's 150 years old, a little more than 150,
Yeah.
and but the real problem is that the Italian people were created mainly during the Second World War. Well,
Mm,
not second, probably between the First and Second World War, because there were many different. I will use the word kingdoms, even though it's not appropriate. But there were. You imagine this small country divided in I don't know 100 different regions, different provinces, different kingdoms in some cases, and during the First World War, they just put on a uniform to some people from Sicily, for example, or from Milan. They spoke totally different languages, and they said, "Okay, now you're Italian," and people said something like, "What's Italy?" It's that thing, that uniform that you have right now, and you have to fight for that country. Okay, cool. you know, that's really something that many people don't know, as well as the fact that in Italy, people, generally speaking, tend not to speak Italian.
mm.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
that may sound weird. We have hundreds of different dialects, which in some cases can be quite close to Italian, and in some other cases, for example, Sicily and the Sicilian dialect is totally different from Italian. Like really another, we're talking another language with
Yes.
different words, different meanings, and people mostly speak their own dialects, and they use the Italian just like in. When you're at the you have to study at the university, or if you're a politician, you're supposed to speak Italian. This kind of stuff. But really, Italy is not really a country. It's more, I don't know, a state of mind than what will define a country or a nation. And Italian does exist as well. So
Yes.
the
Yes. I
sec- the
totally
secret is
understand.
out.
Yeah, it's a lot like China in a lot of ways too. It's like there's so many different like yes, there is
Yeah.
a Chinese language, but there's so many different dialects. A lot of people are familiar with Mandarin and Cantonese, but there's actually more dialects, way more dialects than that, and way more different parts and regions.
Yeah.
And even though it is its own separate country, Taiwan, I always felt like Taiwan was kind of like Sicily. Like Taiwan, what Taiwan is to China, even though it's its own country, it's kind of like what Sicily is. And but yes, I'm very glad you bring that up because it's interesting how when it comes to countries, a lot of people want to shoehorn every country in the world under like the same template
Yeah.
that they're used to. But the reality is, a lot of countries don't work like that. Also look at Africa. Yeah, Africa, they decide, hey, we'll
Oh.
divide this up in a bunch of countries, but that's not really how they were running, before a certain point in time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Africa is a good example of that. They
Yeah.
just and you just need to look at the map and
Right.
see how they decided to draw the borders between nations, which is
Right.
completely bullshit. It's just those straight lines. Yeah, it is much more complicated than that. Okay, this is quickly turning into like an historical geography class. So
Right.
back to
Yeah. See
wrestling.
that kids, you're learning something today, huh?
Yeah,
You get your schooling in.
yeah. Look,
But yes, you're right. Let's go back to wrestling. You're right.
I mean, your YouTube name is literally Dave Knows, so I'm supposed to learn something from you, right?
Hey, just because I know things doesn't mean you don't. We all know stuff, and that's how you know more stuff is by learning.
Exactly. Okay, so we should talk about your channel. How did that started, and if you want to tell, like, what are maybe there is somebody who's not familiar with your product, and if you want to tell what you're dealing with Dave
Uh,
Knows Wrestling.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, yeah, absolutely. So first, as you said, yes, I have a YouTube channel. It's Dave Knows Wrestling, and yes, I would very much appreciate it if you went over, gave a subscribe, watch the videos, like them, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But thank you for allowing me to do that. But when it comes to the YouTube channel, how did it start? Well, years ago, a few years ago, about 3 years ago, is when I came up with the concept. Beforehand, I was a big fan of YouTube. I've been watching YouTube. It slowly began replacing regular TV for me, as in I was more excited.
Yeah.
And with a wide variety of YouTubers. I like Jenna Marbles,
Mhm.
and also Epic Mealtime, bunch of YouTube channels like that. But then at the time, I was actually going to broadcasting school. I was actually attending media, learning media and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And then right when I graduated, I came up with right towards the end when I was graduating, and came up with the idea. And then I was like, I have the resources to do it. I have the know how to do it. So why not? And then so the next day, right after my graduation from school, I decided to start the channel, and I worked on it a lot for like it took me a month before I got things off the ground. Like I thought this would be relatively easy between the editing and all that, but there were so many steps and processes. And so I kind of it took me like my first three videos, it took me a month before because I launched it with three videos. I didn't launch with just one. I had three
Yeah.
off the bat. It took me a month and I like redid them 100 times. And looking back on it now, they're terrible. I don't watch the launch videos. Watch the newer stuff. So it took me a long time. It took me a long time to get that off the ground. But once I got the ball rolling, it was trial by error, and I learned more about doing a YouTube channel. I learned more about my processes and creating content. But more importantly, I will also admit that it made me a better wrestling fan. Made me learn more about wrestling. Made me discover more things about wrestling than I thought there were, and especially learning how to communicate and have ideas and opinions and evidence to back up your claims or find out why you feel the way you do. Because one thing, the biggest takeaway from this channel was it wasn't enough for me to just say, hey, I like this wrestler, or hey, I like this match. I want to know, why
Mhm.
do I like this match more than others?
Yeah.
Why do I prefer one wrestler over others? If I'm going to say somebody's the best this, the biggest that, or whatever, let's get some mathematical proof behind it. Let's get some actual evidence behind it. And then
Mhm.
once you start exploring things like history, things that it's all a little bit of history repeating, storylines coming back together again, or you start looking at ratings and money and things like that, you start noticing a lot of patterns.
Yeah.
So yeah, so for me, that's the biggest takeaway. Like it taught me how to be a better wrestling fan.
And how does it work now? How many videos do you put up per week or per month? And how is it the reaction so far?
Well, during this hooply time period that we're living in right now,
Yeah.
uh, I put out one main video a week. It's going to be looking to push it on Thursday primarily. You know,
Hmm.
uh, set your notifications to find out when specifically, but look for them around Thursday-ish. But aside from that, I've been doing a lot of live streams, as I know you know because you've been attending. Um, a lot of live streams where I get to come on live and also talk to the community. And yes, and I'm glad you actually brought this up because the big one about it is actually the community. Like one thing I pride my channel on is how much I interact with the community. There's also the Discord.
Hmm.
You can find me on Twitter, but we talk on the live streams a lot, and we actually have conversations where if a lot of people don't do live streams, a lot of people don't respond to comments. I respond to most of the comments I get on all my videos. I do read them. I do read them all.
Hmm.
Um, and on top of that, when it comes to live streams, we'll have actual discussions. We'll talk about things and we'll point things out to each other. Where if you go to other wrestling channels or you just go to other YouTube channels in general, they normally don't respond to your comments.
Yeah.
Uh, they probably don't even read them for certain cases. And when they go on a live stream, they're usually not as interactive or even as thankful or not criticizing anybody. I understand they appreciate it, but I feel like I have a genuine rapport with the people who are part of the community, the Know-It-All Nation, as we call them. So, and I think that's a much better thing. So it's not just a YouTube channel, but it really is. It really is a community. It's something where we all interact with each other. We all know each other's tastes and patterns and things like that. Or we start discovering things, or people will point out, "Hey, check this match out," or "Hey, I recommend you watch this," even to me. And then we're all sharing. And again, we learn together. So the more you know is just from admitting that you don't know everything, because there's so much about wrestling, nobody can know it all. But as long as we have other people recommending you this or saying that you check this out or showing you this, it helps grow your knowledge and, hey, get you as close as you possibly can to knowing everything.
Yeah, and I think you're doing a hell of a job because, as I mentioned before, I learned so much stuff through your channel. Trust me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, even because Italy is not a huge wrestling country, at least not at the moment. We mainly had like 3 big waves of mainstream popularity in wrestling, which is like the early 90s. Not so much with Aquamania, because in Italy, the Ultimate Warrior was really famous. I remember as a child, I had a toy about the Ultimate Warrior. But that may have lasted like a year or two tops. Then we had a second wave around 1999 with WCW and Goldberg. I remember that specifically. And that didn't last long as well. And then the third wave of mainstream exposure to wrestling in Italy was from 2005 to 2007, and 2004 probably to 2007, and which is like the ruthless aggression era. And then with the Benoit murder suicide, everything fall apart. No mainstream television wanted to show wrestling anymore, and from that point onwards, we lived pretty much in the age of obscurity. So with that, I want to say thank you, because there is so many things I needed to understand better of how things went historically speaking, and your channel was really a huge help in filling those gaps that I had within my wrestling memory.
Well, hey, no, thank you. As well now a former teacher, since during this time period I'm not that anymore, at least not for now. But that's always a great feeling when you can help you can help be a part of somebody filling in gaps that they want to.
Yeah.
But personally, I do think it's a shame that there are many countries out there in the world. I do think it's a shame they haven't gotten more involved in professional wrestling. Like, Italy is definitely one of them, especially when we go all the way back. Let's go all the way back. The Olympics, Rome, Greco-Roman wrestling. When it comes to actual wrestling, Italy is one of the primary countries historically throughout the entire world. So, I know we were just talking about John Cena and Hulk Hogan and all that, but I mean, if you I'm just going way further back, this is how, and Bruno, no disrespect to those guys, but just wrestling has always been Italy has always been a major, contributor to wrestling in all forms. And so it's weird to me that the country that you could even make the argument is the number one most important historically in all of wrestling. You could make that argument. I'm not saying it is and I'm not saying it isn't, but you could make that argument. But that their professional wrestling scene right now is virtually absent, as you point out. I think that's very strange. Like, don't you?
Yeah. And in the later years, we had, since like the early 2000s, there were a few wrestling federations in Italy, like really, really minor wrestling federation that I'm talking about. And in the latest like 4 to 5 years, there are a couple of those that really started to get some traction, I would say. I don't know if you've had the chance to hear about a federation called the Rising Sun. This was created in 2016, so we're talking about a really fresh federation. And they were doing things more with an indie style, I would say, of wrestling. and the audience was starting to be educated to wrestling. They understand when was right to clap, to cheer for the good guy, or boo the bad guy. This kind of stuff. They really started to do something special in Italy, something that hasn't been done in a quite long time. And then the coronavirus happened.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It
they
ruins
started.
everything. You see that? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they were doing a great job, and they booked many international wrestlers like, I don't know, Will Ospreay, David Starr, Flash Morgan Webster. These kind of names started to, or A-Kid as well, which has been a guest on the show, and really started to do that like an American indie federation probably would do. To you, everything I just said to you must sound really normal, really average, maybe, but it doesn't in Italy. Trust me. So yeah, then unfortunately everything has to be stopped. That's
Yeah.
bad.
Oh, it's
Then
very bad. Yeah. Especially for the independent wrestling community. But since you brought that up, I will admit something on your show that a lot of people don't know about. I've been keeping this quiet. I haven't mentioned. I'm not going to
uh-huh.
mention his name or anything like that. But there was actually somebody who was following my channel who's been, was really cool about it. Said they've been watching and they've been learning, and which I always appreciate to hear. It really is
Yeah.
it is a great feeling. But they mentioned how in their country of Brazil, where they in their particular area they don't have professional wrestling options. So like if you can watch WWE, and if you're a big fan and
Hmm.
you want to be a pro wrestler yourself, like you have to leave was your only option. And so like he wanted to so him and they were trying to talk about how could they possibly get something going. And so they kind of started their own federation, but they said they honestly have zero training. Like they don't know, like they have very little understanding. Like they know how to do the moves from watching TV, but there's certain elements that they knew about wrestling that they're not aware of, and they were asking me to help. So long distance, I was giving them a couple of advice. I actually brought in. I also work for a company known as Catalyst Wrestling.
Hmm.
We just changed names. I almost said the old name. Uh,
So,
Catalyst,
tell
it's
me the new name. Sorry.
Catalyst Wrestling. Sorry.
Catalyst Wrestling. Okay.
Catalyst, yeah. So I brought in a couple of guys from that, and through long, we were telling them like what they should do, how we can help in any way, shape, or form, giving them advice and things like that. And the guy was super grateful about this. But again, I'm not trying to blow up his spot, so I'm not going to reveal who. I'm not going to say anybody's names. But
Okay.
so it's amazing to me. It's not, I know what you're talking about. It's like there's a lot of countries where there is a desire, there is a niche community, but they don't have. How do they start? How do they build a ring? How do they, where can they even begin? And it's unfortunate that you take it for granted in America, like, oh, professional wrestling is like grows on trees around here. But then when you think about the entirety of the world, there's so many hungry hungry wrestling fans out there who want a more genuine experience, or want a more hands-on experience, and want to really go through the paces, and it's harder for them to do so. So I know exactly. So when you hear about the independent scene growing in Italy, I'm pleased to hear that. Unfortunately, yes, the circumstances, that's rough. But I'm rooting for you guys, especially because I think, as I said, I think you would deserve it for sure. And I wouldn't even mind if like Italian style professional wrestling became like a thing, because like British
Yeah.
style is very one thing, the different styles in Japan and in Canada. I would love it if Italy came up with their own style. Like I could just imagine what it could be, like how much fun it could be. Like there could be so many things. Like what if Italy made like brought back Greco-Roman rules where they did professional version of only Greco-Roman, where instead of freestyle wrestling. What if they did that, or what if it was more theatrical? Like there's so many things that I would love to see what Italy could do if they were allowed to get that freedom and ball rolling. If we weren't in our situation that we are now. So I'm very much looking forward to see what the next couple of years hold for Italy in professional wrestling after this is all over. That is.
Well, thank you so much. I will share a couple of clips with you if you want to check some of the promotion I mentioned, and I will pitch your ideas to the people working in that promotion to create an Italian style of wrestling. Thank you so
Hey,
much.
I appreciate that. I'm there. Yeah, and if, I would love to cover. I would love to cover it on my channel at some point in time. So yes, I would appreciate the clips. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And talking about the styles, I remember one of the first videos of you that I've ever saw. It caught my attention because you spoke about many different wrestling styles, and you were talking about, of course, the Canadian style, mainly modeled after Stu Hart's Dungeon, of course.
Mm.
And since I don't know if I'm a Bret Hart fan, because, as I mentioned before, during Bret Hart stardom, wrestling was non-existent in Italy. So I don't know if I can call myself a Bret Hart fan, but I'm a huge fan of Canadian wrestlers in general, and of course of Bret Hart's biography. It's really wonderful, a wonderful read. So, if you want to tell me something about the style of Canada, because if I recall correctly, is one that you particularly enjoy. Maybe what do you like about it? What sensation do you have when you see that particular style of wrestling?
Oh, absolutely. I would. Great question. Great question. And yeah, I am a big fan of Canadian wrestling. It is my preferred style. What gravitates me to the style is, again, a lot of it's when we look at wrestling and especially study styles and the history of how things evolve, you'll learn that it's a weird cycle. It's a weird hodgepodge melting pot
Hmm.
of like style incest. Yeah, I'll say it. It's a
Yeah.
very so Canadian wrestling really came from British wrestling.
Yeah.
And a lot of British wrestling really came from American wrestling, and American wrestling really came from British wrestling. So like back and forth, back and forth. The history of wrestling is fascinating to me. But to clarify that, since that was a very confusing Inception style loop I just brought you on. It really has to do with catch wrestling. Back in the day, some people would refer to the catch wrestlers, people who would try to catch you in a hold. They would call them hookers. Nowadays, nobody really says hookers anymore, but that's what they were called because about how you would hook a hold. The style would be catch as catch can style wrestling, and that was more about holds, and that is something that Canadian wrestling really adapted from British wrestling. And that was also the stuff that got from America, but the American style professional wrestling scene really started from English wrestling in the first place. So
Mhm.
it kind of changed. Like I've covered this on my channel also. Like the styles of wrestling's actually changed. The popular style in England changed. It was more Greco-Roman. Then they started switching to catch as catch. But anyway, but the thing about Canada that really got my attention is that once, especially as you said, Stu Hart, big Stu Hart fan, is they took it to the next level. Stu Hart in particular believed that for professional wrestling to look at its best, for it to be its best, is it can't just be about simulating moves that don't do anything. You should know how to make these moves actually hurt. That way you know what you're doing. Should understand the way body mechanics work. You should understand the way, if like I'm choking you, if I pinch right here, I can cut off your oxygen supply. Like, what would this do to a person? If you were really trying to hurt someone, what would you be doing? And knowing that knowledge and knowing when to pull it back and just not commit to it makes everything work better. It makes it more logical. It puts the psychology in there. And it's like a lot of people talk about, let's say, strong style with the
Yeah.
moves, with some of the strikes they do. They are legitimate strikes. They are making contact, and it does hurt. Those are the kinds of things they do in strong style, some of that stuff. And people really like that. But with Canadian, it's not so much about the striking hurting, like the punches and all that. It's more about the holds,
Mhm.
which is what I think people forget about wrestling. Wrestling shouldn't be about punching. For me, it's supposed to be about grappling. It's supposed to be about, and professional wrestling is supposed to be about creating that enhanced form of simulated combat, taking grappling
Totally
and just
agree.
yes,
Totally agree
exactly.
with you.
Right. We cannot agree on that enough. We cannot stress that enough. So let that be a lesson to you kids. But one thing, so when it comes to Stu Hart, that was one thing he stressed is that you should know how to do this stuff for real. You should be able to fight for real. And the knowing how is also how you learn to keep people safe too. It's also an extremely safe style
Mhm.
because people pull it back and you know what hurts a person and what does not hurt a person. So you just ride right on the other side of the line to make sure it still looks as good as it possibly can without actually hurting anybody. People have often said, Brett never really seriously injured anybody in a match. And that's one of the biggest things that he prides himself on, and it's one of my favorite aspects about him too. And the
Yeah.
other thing people don't realize about Brett and Stu is that amateur level wise, they were phenomenal wrestlers. The Hart family in general. Brett was one of the most decorated in amateur before he became pro, and it has been said by coaches repeatedly that if he did not pursue professional wrestling, he probably would have been an Olympic wrestler, and he could have gone really far in it. So, and that's not a gimmick. That's actually 100% legitimate. He was on the verge of being an Olympic wrestler when he decided to just go to professional wrestling instead.
Yeah, that's great, and I agree totally with you. As I said, we had really limited exposure to wrestling, but one of the first things that I distinctly remember is the commentators explaining that punching was forbidden, and nowadays everybody does the punches in wrestling, and I hate it. I totally hate it. Not only because somebody told me it was forbidden, but because it looks fake. That's the
Yes.
fakest thing that they can do in the ring to me. That is really
Yes.
fake. You can, yeah, if you go punch somebody, you literally can kill the other person.
Right.
And and
Right.
if you're able to punch 10 times a person in the head and nothing happens, that screams fake more than any other wrestling move.
Right. Yeah. One solid punch will make somebody's face swell up, and that's all it takes. And you're saying that this big muscle man is going to punch somebody straight in the face and not a mark to show for it? That's impossible. Like, that's just not how physics work.
Yeah.
Um, and I've always liked wrestlers like Harley Race. Harley Race was a guy who he threw punches, but he didn't do it very often. And when he did, it was important. It wasn't like I'm going to throw this at you 50 times and we're just going to just keep walking like nothing's happening. It was one of those things where if I punched you, you had to act like it hurt. We had to make sure that it didn't come across as phony, because that I agree with you. That's I hate the punches. And there's some wrestlers who do nothing but punch nowadays, and they're still called
Yeah.
wrestlers.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
And
we cannot agree with you more.
the only example that comes to my mind of a wrestler who does punch people in the face and probably was the first one in the modern era to do it quite often, but it makes sense, is the Big Show. Because if you
Yeah,
think about it, people criticize that move a lot because it doesn't know how to throw a real punch. Okay, I don't care about that. But that made sense because every time that he threw a punch, that was the finish. Every time. So if you think, for example, the match that he had against Cody Rhodes at WrestleMania for the IC title, it was basically just that, just one big punch to Cody's face. But that makes sense because you know that a punch to the face is little, is literally little, and
right.
other people do that all the time and nothing happens. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'm going to conclude my rant about punches right now.
Hey, no,
Yeah.
I was with you. I was thinking it the whole way.
Since you're a content creator and a YouTuber, and I haven't started this channel like that long ago. It's a month and a half, 2 months tops, and I'm still learning many things. And one particular thing that everybody seems to value a lot, but to me it's literally a rabbit hole that that once you go inside is very difficult to get out of it, is how to understand your analytics of the
Oh,
videos. What's your experience about it, especially when you first started? Did you find yourself in the rabbit hole?
I mean, yes, I did. And I'll start this by saying that I'm probably like the worst person to ask about this, because I don't, I will self-admit I do not care about them as much as I should. But like you said, I went down the rabbit hole in the beginning, and then I was like, wow, I am going to get lost in this. So, I just said, forget it. And I just said, I'm going to do what I want to do, the best of my ability, and I will only take this in mild consideration. But because, as you mentioned, it is one of those things you get lost in. But in the beginning, for me, it was an interesting process. Again, I can't thank them enough. But Wrestle Talk, Ollie Davis, very kind to me in the beginning of the channel, helped out tremendously. British wrestling YouTube channel. So in the beginning of it, a lot of my fan base actually was British. So,
Yeah.
and they still are. It's just, the rest of the channel has grown. So my demographic, there was a huge English population, and coincidentally, it helped that I am a big British, because as I mentioned, Canadian wrestling and British wrestling. I'm a big
Hmm.
British wrestling fan, and the British wrestling scene is really hot right now. So coincidentally, I happen to be a British wrestling fan. So I did start catering more towards my British fan base. I have several videos about British style wrestling and giving information about it. One of my favorite comments I ever got was somebody who was from England who said, "I'm British, and this guy just taught me more about British wrestling than I knew." Okay, I'm in. So that was one of my favorite comments I've ever gotten. Um, but so yeah, you start targeting, you start going along the lines. And for me, it was really just a thank you because I thought it wasn't fair that a lot of Americans don't know from British wrestling. So I thought it was not only a thank you to them, but it was also just because I was like, Americans really should know more about this. It's not really right because our wrestling scene came was derivative of the English wrestling scene. So as as the chain of command goes, as I talked about earlier.
Hmm.
So you start doing things like that, but then you start noticing other patterns, like things that I don't necessarily want to talk about. That I'm not as lucky for, like British wrestling. Like like certain things will get more popular, like new, like this is not even a bad thing. It just doesn't. It's just
Hmm.
not where I need to go. But like new stuff, topical stuff tends to be more
Yeah.
popular. Like if something just happens today, more people will click on it on a video if you talk about something that happened today or yesterday than they will about evergreen topics.
Yeah.
So and there was a pressure to do that because like I have to try and be as fast as possible. But then the work suffers because I'm not putting as much quality or care into it. I'm just trying to bang it out as fast as possible so it stays hot as quickly as I can. And that's what kind of the analytics, and they change a lot. It's an ever changing algorithm for YouTube. So like what is true today may not be true next week. They might say, hey,
Yeah.
like you notice like YouTubers say, hey, give me a like, and then like in a couple of months they'll say, give me your notifications instead, and they'll really push the notifications because it's whatever YouTube decides is the most important thing that day. But so it was driving me crazy. So like I couldn't, I know I can't keep up. Like, and again, all the respect in the world to Wrestle Talk, who can bang out news content. They bang out content every day, even during this situation we're in right now. They're banging out content every day, staying relevant, staying on top of things. So good for them. Um, but that's also part of why I do live streams because I'm like, okay, well, I don't have to edit. I'll just talk about it and people won't mind that it's not as smooth and polished. But I prefer talking about history. I prefer like doing research, going into it, and making as much of a historical backlog as possible. So when it comes to the analytics, yes, I got lost in it. You can study and mesmerize it. Will it help you grow your channel if you follow it? Absolutely. Is it great to be able to know the specific communities that are watching you and what they like and try and cater to them or show your appreciation of them? Absolutely, that is great. I totally believe in that, and I have no problem with that. However, sometimes if it's not you, if it's not true to yourself, if it's not the kind of content you want to make, I personally don't. I'm not a slave to the algorithm.
Hmm.
Maybe I should be. Maybe I'd be better off if I was, but nonetheless, I do the kind of thing I want to do. I show appreciation to the people who are there when I can, but I'm not willing to completely acquiesce to some computer metric that tells me what I need to do and what I don't. So, like I said, I may not be the best person to ask about this, but that's just personally what I do. That's personally what I believe. I could be wrong, but that's just how I roll.
No, no, I love your answer because it's exactly how I'm feeling. I feel like I'm getting lost, and the algorithm is ever changing, and you have to stay on top of everything. And in the end, maybe you risk to lose focus on what you really wanted to do in the first place. So yeah, I totally back you up on this one. Be mildly, mildly attentive to that. Yeah, that's the way, in my opinion.
I like it. Mildly attentive. That's a great way of putting it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Dave, thank you so much for this chat. It really, the minutes like flew by in a heartbeat. I really love talking to you. And before we go, just plug all of your channels, everything that you want to plug.
Okay, you can find me on YouTube at Dave Knows Wrestling primary channel. I would appreciate any support you have to give to the channel, but also Dave Knows Comics, much smaller channel, more of a side hustle. But if we could get that up there to the next level, I would appreciate that too. And during this time, as I briefly mentioned, economy wise not doing so good over here. So if you can, and if you have the help to give, if you want to give support, check out my Patreon page, Dave Knows Wrestling, over on Patreon. Any support you have to give really does get me through this time. I cannot stress that enough. But thank you for having me on this show. I very much appreciate it, and thank you for all the kind words. And I completely agree with you. The time just flew. This was a very natural conversation, great conversation. I had a lot of fun being here. So thank you for having me here.
You're so welcome, Dave. Thank you so much. And who knows, maybe we can do that another time. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye. It was an immense pleasure to talk with Dave, and I didn't even realize that this was my longest interview to date. Really, time went by in a heartbeat. Next week, episode number 23 of the Last Minute Wrestling Podcast will feature the Scottish independent wrestler Eli Bulwark. With him, we're going to talk about his career both inside the ring and behind the scenes at places like Insane Championship Wrestling and many other Scottish promotions. Thank you for listening. Remember to leave a comment, like, share, subscribe and spread the word. To make sure we keep our content going, you can buy us a coffee on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/lmwpodcast or become a Patreon backer at patreon.com/lmwpodcast. You can find the Last Minute Wrestling Podcast all over the platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podchaser and more. We are also very social, so drop us a line to say hello on Twitter at LMW Podcast and on Facebook at facebook.com/LMW Podcast. I've been Frank Mandolini. Stay safe.